Introducing my friend Jack Weinstein. And water polo and baseball coach at Milpitas High School, where he started teaching in the mid-1970s. His own education his higher education consisted of a bachelor's degree in English that he earned from Hayward State, and two teaching credentials, and a master's in education and a master's in English, also from Hayward State, right? A Hayward boy. The organization that he works for, aside from Milpitas High School, is called Facing History and Ourselves, a leading, perhaps the leading, educational institute in the United States focusing on issues of identity formation, prejudice, discrimination, scapegoating, and other contributory phenomena in the overall phenomenon of violence, all against a historical background in which the Holocaust figures centrally. Facing History and Ourselves is in business to inform and train teachers, police, and other public officials on violence-related issues. It has offices in 7 cities nationwide and in Switzerland. And Jack has been the program director for Northern California for Facing History and Ourselves since 1996. He is a skilled teacher of teachers, a great role model for our society's learners, young and old, and a powerful creator of sensitivity, caring, and peace. Jack Weinstein, welcome back to Sonoma State and the Holocaust Lecture Series.
He's a little taller than I am. I may have to move this. And I'll probably move beyond it because I'm not behind a podium. If that causes a problem for anyone in terms of what they can hear, just raise your hand and I'll know if it's not a question that I need to raise my voice. Even with a cold, I have a teacher's voice, so it's practiced on many high school campuses, and I don't expect to have any problem with it. I hope it doesn't cause any problem for the recording of the presentation either. My goal today is not talk at you for very long at any one time, but to speak with you and even at points to encourage your voice and your questions and your responses in relation to some of the things that I'm going to present to you and show to you tonight. As you can see, I'm not Cecil Williams, and I probably will not rock the house the way he will. I plan to come back if I can on May 9th, because he's one of a few people on your list that I haven't been able to hear speak in person yet. I would really look forward to that. I'm pleased to be here somewhat in his stead, but actually as an exchange person in his honor to a degree. Sonoma State's close to my heart for a number of reasons. Sonoma State is one of the arenas which has chosen to its community members and its students and its faculties take a look at making meaning of a very difficult history. They've done so not in a way which just allows Holocaust education to bubble up through the curriculum in some way, but in an organized way, through the establishment of alliances with a variety of schools and organizations, through the leadership of Holocaust survivors and professors, some in the same person, and in the way that they relate this. I think this series is a very, very important series, and I wish that other state universities would emulate it. So I just want to suggest that as you go out into the world in your own way, you realize that what's happening here is unique and very special. I'm just very proud to be a part of it. What I'd like to begin with today is a look at what Facing History does and what I do. And I'd like to do that through the eyes of children rather than through my words. So, unusual for me, I'm going to start with a video instead of with a speech. And I'll be asking you a question about it when we're done, and I'm going to hope that some of you are able to overcome any shyness you might have and participate in a discussion. Following that, we're going to talk about some other things that I think will be germane to the entire series that you're dealing with. But let's start with some student voices right away.
For conscience and to learn tolerance. The program asks grade school students to consider tough questions about the human condition. Their views are often profound.
I know, just as it's human nature to love, it's also human nature to hate. And people have a tendency to hate.
Just take away your top layer and you're all the same, you know? You might have different ideas, but I have yet to understand why people can just discriminate because of that, and I guess it'll always be a mystery to me.
That's one reason why we discussed the Holocaust, reason why we discussed the Harlem Renaissance last year and talked about the brutality and the prejudice against African Americans in this country, is that forgetting is dangerous.
They came for the Jews, and nobody said anything because they wanted to do, and then Protestant and everything. Then finally they came for them. And by that time, nobody was there to speak up for them.
That just reminded us, the hangman. The hangman comes for the Irish, but I wasn't Irish, so I didn't worry about it. The hangman comes for the Polish people, but I'm not Polish, so what am I worried about? The Polish people are gone. The hangman comes for the African American people, but I'm not African American. If they're not touching me, they're not bothering my family, no problem. The difficult thing about it is not the facing history, it's the facing ourselves. That's the difficulty.
And so before, people hate people that don't look like them, right? I feel that's kind of wrong, because if you hate somebody that doesn't look like you, that means you can't learn more about them, or you can't know their religion or whatever.
We may have different qualities, but we're all human beings. Gotta act like it.
People say, I'm not faced with anything, but you're faced with it every day. If you watch the news or if you watch anything, you could make a choice to say, that's not right, we better do it. But most people just watch the 6 o'clock news, go eat dinner, and then, that's it.
When something like Hitler's Nazism happens, if enough people go against it, it wouldn't happen. But if not enough people go against it, those people are the ones who get killed. Those people are the ones who suffer. And the thing that really scares me is I could bring myself to jeopardize everything that I have. Well, it's not always against just different ethnic groups, and it's also against people who aren't like you, people who are smarter than you, or not as smart as you, or also gay people, lesbians and stuff. I mean, they're just, but people, people don't see it that way.
If I was with my friends, I'd probably hope that they wouldn't think they're gay, because I know some of my friends would rag on them. But honestly, if I was walking by myself down the street and I saw a couple of gay guys, it wouldn't mean anything to me. Doesn't matter to me. I don't think any less of them.
So if you were walking with your friends and they started ragging on them, what would you
I either say shut up or I'd go in with them. It makes me sound like a jerk, but it's peer pressure, so.
Sometimes you have the strength or the will to go against your friend. I mean, if you're real friends, then if you're going to go against them, usually you're not going to, break their friendship.
A lot of people would not want to put their foot down, especially if it means the end of their family or something that they really love, but there are a lot of other people who are finding within themselves to stand up for what they really feel is right. If you want to know a simplistic, quick answer to how we might change our society quickly, it would be to start listening to our kids. Kids get it. They understand that they can erase the swastika, that to say the word nigger is painful to someone. They can begin to understand that it's now to change your behaviors than it is when it's too late. History teaches you that.
We're going to come on back in just a moment with Doreen Duran.
So let's talk about this for just a minute. Can everybody hear me okay? Better than the video, I'm sure. What did you hear that resonated with you from of the students? What were the pieces that stood out for you as you listened? Students grappling with issues that came up as a result of a unit that they studied, connecting the Holocaust to the moral dilemmas that they face in their everyday lives. What did you hear that resonated with you? Yes?
Having to stand up to peer pressure.
Okay, there's a big issue, of course, for young people, having to stand up to peer pressure. And of course, we're not comparing peer pressure that he's talking about to the kind of pressure that came about in a particular time and place in a larger, more horrific history than what he's describing in a conversation on the street. On the other hand, the language that he's using to describe that may very well fit and allow him to make better meaning of the history he's learning than he would ordinarily or than he would otherwise. What else did you hear that resonated with you? Yes?
One of the young men said that we're all human beings, but we have to act like human beings.
We're all human beings, we have to act like it. The idea, actually, in this particular class, this was several years ago, and some of these children have been followed and tracked through their careers in high school and beyond. And a couple of them are actually planning eventually on teaching history. Simply what we've been taught to call them, or do they exist objectively? Are human beings supposed to act in a specific way? Or is everything relative to someone's experience, thank you very much, or to someone's situation? And that is a question that emerges out of this kind of conversation. What else did you hear?
What resonated with me was the young boy who said that when people were faced with certain pressures, if they didn't what they wanted, they would jeopardize everything. And I think that goes along with this question. I mean, to act like a human being, what does that mean? To be a human being, isn't that presuppose that human beings are somehow good, that they're going against the good? But obviously we see that being a human being means that there are certain human beings that are doing things that are not good.
He actually is upset at himself to a degree in that moment when he speaks, when he says, I'm not sure I could jeopardize everything I have in order to do the right thing. Thinking to myself, I have 3 children. They're 19, 16, and 13, 2 boys and a girl. And I think I would be happy to hear any of my 3 children make such a statement in a classroom, on a tape or not on a tape, in front of a group of people about their ethical abilities, about their moral philosophy. That young man has had an opportunity to grapple with history and with his own moral dilemmas to the degree that allows him to make a suggestion that one of the failures for human beings is that we're not often willing to jeopardize what we have or what we think we have in order to make a clear stance that we know already is right. To me, that's a remarkable statement for a 13 of millions of people who have died. If we step back from it and make meaning from it about our own daily lives and our peer pressures that we face, what are we doing to the history? On the other hand, if we don't make some analogies that are developmentally appropriate, and adolescents live in their own lives, they live in their own histories, they live in their own moments. They can't be taken willy-nilly to a faraway place, another generation on another continent, and simply be given the lessons and have it whoosh, make a difference in their lives. They're going to have to articulate it, and they're going to have to articulate what meaning they make from it, making meaning of it from their own experiences, from their own struggles, no matter how trivial they may seem to adults or to people who lived those histories. Developmentally, it's an absolutely appropriate thing to do for that young man to have a unit of history which forces him to wrestle with his own demons, with his own struggles, with his own moral boundaries. And for a 14-year-old in Boston or in San Francisco or Rohnert Park or Katati, Sebastopol, I don't care where, not to wrestle with those demons as a result of dealing with this history may be a failure of our pedagogy, may be a failure of the way we Allow people to make meaning and trust that they are works in progress. And that as time goes on, they will extend the meaning that they make. The other thing that's interesting about this is that what's the starting point? Is the starting point the history? Or is the starting point their own struggles? And can we somehow meet in the middle? Well, that's a big question. If I had the answer to it, maybe doing a bigger job than directing a small nonprofit in the Bay Area, but I don't think that even the current administration would see me as an education czar. And if I had the answers to those questions, though, perhaps I would be in a bit of a larger field than working for a nonprofit dealing with these issues on the ground. This morning, I was at Thurgood Marshall, San Francisco. It's an inner city school serving primarily students from Bayview, Hunters Point, but all around San Francisco as well. And as a part of their Facing History and Ourselves journey, they have been looking at literature about issues and histories like the Holocaust, like apartheid in South Africa, like civil rights in the United States. They've made a year-long commitment in some classes at Thurgood Marshall to examine those histories and to attempt to make meaning from them, to face history and themselves. So this morning, when I got there, the idea was to attempt to conduct a discussion about something that had come up in the classroom. And what had come up in the classroom for these students was the issue of forgiveness. Someone had asked the question last week in the midst of a literary study in which there was absolute terror on the books. How could human beings do to each other what is being described in a book like Night, or in a book like Survival in Auschwitz by Primo Levi? How could people do those things to other people? And once they've done them, how do you move forward? How does a society recover balance? Does it ever? How do you recompense? How do you reconcile? How do you repair? Internally and externally. Internally for yourself and externally with other people, some of whom are responsible for some of that pain that has been dealt out. How do you do that? Now, why did the question come up? The question came up because there was a feud going on in the classroom. And they weren't forgiving of each other. And they weren't speaking to each other over something that we would call absolutely trivial. Over a matter of popularity, or a matter of whose voices got heard in the classroom and whose didn't, or over a matter of a slight in the hallway, or a bump on the way to a chair in the classroom. And someone had the foresight in the midst of this content that was asking them to wrestle and grapple with these deep issues. Someone had the foresight to say, doesn't this have something to do with what we're studying? And out of that question came the resolve to tackle another book. And the teacher, because the teacher was wise and knew what options could present themselves, decided that it was time to step back and into another world, another time, another place, another continent, which is also belonging to us in many, many ways. And she chose The Sunflower by Simon Wiesenthal, which, in case you're not familiar with it, I highly recommend it for a number of reasons, even though it may not be considered great literature by literature teachers. But it is a book that poses a phenomenal question to people. The question it poses is about forgiveness, because the protagonist in the story, Simon himself, is taken off a chain labor gang, a slave labor gang, and into a former high school arena, which is being used as a hospital. And he doesn't know why he's been pulled away from his work, and he's taken into this hospital singly by a nurse who's taken him off of this duty for a few minutes and plunked into a room with a dying Nazi. Alone. Man swathed in bandages from head to toe. The man obviously dying. Well, the man begins to tell Simon of where he's been and what he's done. And he begins his story with the word, I'm 21 years old, and I was not born a murderer. We learn in the narrative that he attempts, with many interruptions by Simon, to question, why am I here? What do you want from me? What's my role in all this? What's it got to do with me? If you want forgiveness, go to a priest or minister. You were an altar boy. Go to your parents. Your father hasn't spoken to you since you joined this rabbi. What do you want with me? And he says to him through clenched lips and through the bandages on his face, I need the forgiveness of a Jew before I can die. And he begins to tell him the story of how he was mortally wounded. And the mortal wound came to him in a moment of hesitation that was caused by a moment too few to count of his conscience, because he recalled a mass murder in which he had participated. And the sight of a burning building boarded up with him on the outside manning a machine gun in a place in the Ukraine where mass murders such as that were very common. And he remembered the look on the face of a parent holding a child in his arms at the window of a building. Out of they came, they would be shot as the building burned. And the father was pointing to heaven as if to tell his child, soon we will be in a different and better place. This was his interpretation. And he shot, and he murdered, and he went on with his duties. But it haunted him. And in one movement, sometime later, he hesitated. Does my family life suggest? What does my culture suggest? What does all the literature I've ever read suggest? What kind of person do I want to be? Can I go back to my barracks and tell my bunkmates that I offered a word of solace to a dying Nazi? My God, my next-door neighbor made a bigoted comment once, and I haven't forgiven him yet. I haven't forgiven him. I can't look at him without remembering what he said. In a heated moment, in a stupid moment, in a moment that is perhaps forgivable, because 90% of the time, he's not acting out in an evil way. And if my children came home from school and were locked out of the house, they might go next door to get the extra key. Or they might call on him for safety's sake. If my wife or I weren't home and something went on in the house, he's the closest neighbor. And he's not evil all the time. But you know, one day he made a terrible remark in front of me. And it wasn't even about me. But it was about me. Because it was about a man who drove up across the street to look at the house that was for sale. And the man was wearing a Sikh headdress. And my neighbor looked at me and I looked at him, and we were mowing our lawns adjacent to each other. And he looked at me and he said, oh shit, that's all we need. And then I had a moral quandary. With my daughter on the front porch, and I'm going to be silent in a moment of bigotry? Not likely. Not likely. So I said, come on, man, you know I don't feel that way. Why do you say stupid things like that? But it's not just a moment, and it's frozen in time, and I never will trust him quite the same again, even years later. Because if that's what came out in the moment about a man in a Sikh headdress, when I put on my kippah on Friday night, I'm not Orthodox, so I drive to the synagogue. When I put on my kippah and I drive out of the driveway on a Friday night to go to temple, what thoughts is he secretly harboring? And when my son's friends come over, and they are a multicultural lot, and he's out in front waving, what's he really thinking? And I can't get it out of my head. And I'm not quite willing to just simply forgive him, especially in a way that's cheap grace. And, oh, I'm just in a bad mood, doesn't cover it. It doesn't cover it. Because somewhere down deep there's something else that I don't trust, and that I'm a bit afraid of, and that I think lurks in so many hearts and in so many minds that we be damn careful to recognize it and understand it and work with it when we can, but also not to give it such easy passport into our world of forgiveness. So if I can't quite get over it, and every time I see him, that's the first thought that comes to my mind, and if these kids at Thurgood Marshall brought up forgiveness because of a slight in the classroom or in the hallway, or between two different ethnic groups that don't quite jive classroom, in this case, it's African American and Asian, and there is a world apart outside, even in good places like Thurgood Marshall, which has approached these pieces. Why do people sit together in the cafeteria is a valid question. And people do not look at each other with trust. And they do not look at each other with open arms. And they do not forgive each other so easily for the imagined or real slurs that are either in their mind or coming off their lips. So what are we to do? And in this class, they stepped back from the fray, and they tried to approach it intellectually. Now for me, born in 1950 in America, to American-born parents, it's a mix of emotional and intellectual energies that I when I think about making meaning from the Holocaust. But to these children, these young adults at Thurgood Marshall, who maybe had a first exposure to the world of Holocaust studies with Schindler's List when they were 10, or maybe through Diary of Anne Frank when they were in 8th grade, because it's taught very often. This is an academic exercise in some ways, and what we're doing is infusing where there are thousands of headstones, each one standing not for a person, but for an entire community that has been wiped off the face of the earth. But this is the wrestling match in which we engage all the time when we deal with issues of Holocaust studies, and when we deal with issues of how do we step back from it and do the ourselves piece. What's the ourselves piece? When do we do it? How do we do it? The war criminal that was just captured and whose extradition has not been granted because he's suffering from dementia? Where do you stand on all that? They asked these survivors, where do you stand on the issue of forgiveness? And they listened very carefully to what these people had to say. And they got to ask the literati about forgiveness. A papal nuncio has something to say. The president of Notre Dame University has something to say. Jewish theologians have something to say. Cynthia Ozick has something to say. And they read the statements of these people, and they're often surprised at a Jewish theologian who should think or what you should feel about such a momentous question in circumstances that I will never comprehend fully. And the students have to wrestle with each other and with themselves, not about what they would do, but maybe about what they would like to do. And not even in that situation, but to turn it inward and say, what does it mean about me? What does it mean about the times in my life when I can't? Who ignored the plight of a 7-year-old girl while his friend was killing her in the bathroom of a casino in Las Vegas. But he's never been charged with any crime. The killer is in jail for life. But the bystander who saw it over the bathroom stall and chose to leave and not alert any, and who only testified under duress and under pressure, and who entered Cal Berkeley the following fall and lives in a dorm and sometimes has to be followed around by a security guard because people are so angry at him, and they're angry at the university for letting him in because it was a moral failure, and there's no way to judge that on our standardized tests or when we circle misspelled words on the journal entries of children writing about such ideas. And he wanted to know what I would want for my son. Would I want my son to make his own decision? Would I want my son to move in with David Cash if he were assigned him as a roommate? That's a big question. That's a big question. What should the university do? Hands went up all over the room. I don't think they should have let him in, one kid said. Another kid raised his hand and said, of course they should have let him in. There's nothing in his college resume. He had good grades, high SATs. He never broke a law according to anybody, except a moral law. Where does the university get to draw its lines? What's the role of the university? And another guy raised his hand and said, that's just like what we read about do you take the oath in Nazi Germany. That's just like what we read about a college professor in Nazi Germany in the early stages of Nazism who was given a choice to leave his post if he didn't sign the loyalty oath. Way back when there was not a raging torrent, but one small step at a time, could someone have put their foot in the way of that stream? What if hundreds had failed to take the oath? Thousands had failed to take the oath? We will never know. And it might have led to some mass murders beyond what was there, because the Nazis weren't moved by the Gandhian principles that eventually the British were moved by. The Nazis may have thanked people for identifying themselves so readily. There's no clear-cut answer to these questions. But the idea that in a 10th grade class dealing with night, survival in Auschwitz, the Sunflower, David Cash, a schoolyard fight, classroom politics, wrestling back and forth and fighting with each other, and I was reminded immediately of my own classroom 5 years ago when I was still in the classroom full-time at Milpitas High School. And we covered 33 to 38. Stage 1, the legalization of ostracism. We looked carefully at so many of the laws that were passed. We looked at their relationship to eugenics law in American history. We looked at their relationship, their emulation of some Jim Crow laws in America. We looked at what was unique about them, and we looked at the precursors that allowed them to come into being in the first place. Anti-Semitism, or Jew hatred as I prefer to call it. We looked at it with open eyes. And these children knew 5 years ago in that classroom that it didn't pop up as an aberration in society, that it had a long history, that it had its own flow, that it had its own integrity, that it had its own meaning, and that it would have to be overcome in large ways, not just small ways, not just limited local ways, global ways, if it were to be defeated in the heart of people, especially in Western civilization. And they looked, and one young woman raised her hand, and today took me back to that day, because a young woman raised her hand, and she had tears in her eyes, and she said, this is just like Prop 187, Mr. Weinstein. And another hand went up and said, how could statement? There are no graveyards full of people due to 187. There are no ash heaps of human beings because of 187. It's a very important distinction. It's not unimportant. And the young woman was very brave because she had been brought to this country illegally as a tiny child, but she knew her own history by a coyote over the border. And her among the people who would break a doctor appointment in the wake of Prop 187, not understanding that in a democracy there would be some court protections before it could be put into being. And she wanted to know, would I obey the law and report her? Because I knew who she was. I knew that her parents were illegal immigrants. And that's a moral question. It never came to be in that room. And it hopefully will never come to be, excuse my politicking. Reasonable people may disagree about such issues, but you'll have to do it with me one-to-one outside. And she made a connection, and then the discussion opened. What is this like? This period that we're studying, this pre-gas chamber period. What is it comparable to? What kind of language does it teach us about ostracism? Do we dare to make analogies about it? Is it fair to do that? What would Holocaust survivors say about such analogies? What would historians say? Why are we doing this in the first place? What's important to me as a teacher? I want them to know that Hitler came to power in 1933. I want them to know that in 1934 it was the melding of Nazism and Germanism with the ascension to the presidency, as well as the chancellorship of Germany. I want them to know about the Nuremberg laws in 1935. I want them to be able to enumerate them, because they tell an amazing story about membership in society. And then I want them to step back and say, what does it mean to have a society in this? Because membership is not given to the widest possible. What does it mean about a democracy like our own? Who do we look at to judge our democracy? Not the most popular, not the most powerful. The least powerful. The least popular. We look at how they're doing as a way of judging how we're doing. I want them to understand what happened in 1936 in the Olympics. I want them to know the true story of Jesse Owens. That it was an aberration. That we politicized it. That the real story of the 1936 Olympics is that it was a tremendous propaganda route for Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. Because they did win more medals than the other countries. I want them to know that in 1936 and 37, American money was still supporting, still doing big business with Nazi Germany. To know about Kristallnacht in 1938, I want them to know the details of it. I want to test them on it. I want them to know who Herschel Greenspan was in 1938, who assassinated a German official, a minor German official, von Rath. I want them to know about what the Nazis did as a result of that, to ship his body back to Berlin and hold a big state funeral so that they could arrange Kristallnacht, Night of Broken Glass, the November pogrom. I want them to know that and all of what follows in great detail. And along the way, I want them to stop. And I want them to ask important questions. Can you do me a favor and get that whiteboard while I rant a bit? Because we're okay. Okay. Because there are themes that come out in the midst of an important theology, layered and detailed and studied in a way that deserves precision, and in a way that and in a way that deserves, I don't know that I'll be able to do this unless there's a pen.
That's what I was looking for.
Oh, great. Thanks. Thanks. I'll probably knock this thing over in my zeal. I want them to know the history about which the society has a right to ask them. I want them to know, I want my children to be historically literate. Because unless they are, they're stuck at the level of a generality. And a generality is no more than a sermon. It's no more than a sermon. Makes you feel good, you can check it off now, you did your moral development for the week and you can go home. What I want the hooks to hang on these kinds of questions. I want to ask very strongly questions about identity, questions about the role of the individual in society and how they are shaped by people's vision of their own and other people's identities. How do we do that? We start with the self. We start with where we get our own moral and ethical and personal value systems. And to deal with identity, because the power of identity to shape the way we act with other people and the way we look at ourselves is crucial. Identity is often assigned. It's not just there. It's assigned. It's given. It's articulated. I tell you, I'm a teacher. That has meaning to me. I know what it means. I know what I mean by the word. I tell you, I'm a Jew. What I mean by those words. I know what that says when I say it out loud. I don't know what you mean when you look at me and say, he's a Jew, or he's an American, or he's a Californian, or he's a lightweight, not a scholar, or he sure likes to talk a lot. Identity is assigned, and it's also chosen. And I want them to wrestle with their own identities and with how they view other people and how their vision of other people has to be done very carefully and with some humility, because everybody is as complicated as they are. Every single person is as complicated as they are, so that identity has to do with your gender. I've been told that by a lot of people, especially my wife. And if your identity has to do with your, and I put this in quotes, your race, what else does it have to do with? Who does on Yom Kippur? I know what it means to separate my responsibility to God and my responsibility to people, and to join them as well. But I have a very precise definition in my head that comes to me because of my religious background. It colors the way I read Simon Wiesenthal's story. It colors the way I responded to students this morning. What else does it include? Yeah. Sexuality, absolutely. Community, are you thinking about it geographically? Or environment, sure. And I'm going to add to it that I think my life is very different today than it would be if I had been born and raised in Mississippi and stayed there. Because I'm a quintessential Californian, and it really does seep into everything I am and everything that I do. Everything I value, all the way I communicate, even the way I use my hands. I think it's very California. So, geography is important. What else goes on this list? Your education, and gosh, here's the dilemma here. These don't answer any questions because they can each go off in 100 different directions themselves. So what happens, people have a chance to engage about identity, and they say to themselves, I'm a lot more complicated than I thought. And that's not all there is to me. It's not the only fact of importance in my life. And when people see me, maybe they see me in a lot of ways. And maybe I need to see people in a lot of ways. And once that's in place, the definition of prejudice falls into great question. Now that may seem simplistic to a group of an adult community of learners. It is not simple to young people who you can go into their classroom 6 months after the school year begins and ask the question, as I did the other day in a Hayward classroom, how many of you in this classroom know the first and last name of every other student in the room? And there were only 5 students out of 30 who could name every student in the classroom. But they've been together for 6 months. So they're willing to have thoughts about each other based on race, religion, gender, perceptions perhaps about sexuality, perceptions about membership in the community, perceptions about popularity, and they're not willing to test those perceptions in reality. They're given an opportunity. So I would say that the first and foremost thing that has to go on in a Holocaust education or any kind of education program is community building. And when it's absent, we're operating at the level of a generality and at the level of a sermon. Now, maybe not for adult learners in the same way, but I suspect it's so even there. Yes? Yeah, yeah. It's too easy. I shouldn't actually differentiate it. I should differentiate it. What I mean by adult learners is a group of people committed to moving forward around specific themes together as a community. Now, this may be a pretty diverse community. You may not all know each other, but you've all come here over and over again, perhaps, for a particular reason. So I'm willing to generalize to a degree that the intentions are good, and that what you're going to try and make out of all these pieces that you get done for you or to you, you're going to try and take it somewhere in your own lives. This is not the case in every classroom. It's not the case in a captain's. It's different when it's a captive audience. So I'm differentiating based on your intention, and I'm differentiating based on how captive you are and why you're here. And adult learners can be 15-year-old adult learners. Thurgood Marshall today was full of adult learners. Hands were up all over the place. Yes?
I don't really understand your analogy about knowing someone's first name and last name, because I could easily know
Sure.
everyone in this class' first name and last name compared to who they are.
Sure, I used it only as a symbol of how much interaction they've had, and only as a symbol of how well they know each other. Only as a symbol of whether they've had to have face-to-face conversations with each other, ever, in 6 months. Or of whether the teacher had enough sense, pedagogical mastery, to suggest that if you're going to talk about something as important as some of these issues, you might need to know something about each other first. You might build a community first where such conversations are emotionally safe. It's not often done. So I'm suggesting that that's a very important piece of this, and that it has to be done when, not as a separate little unit in the first week of school, but throughout the unit. I don't put people together at Thurgood Marshall this morning without saying, you're going to discuss a question about forgiveness, and the first thing you need to do with each other is make a personal connection, make sure you know who it is, and then share one idea about forgiveness that's based on your own experience in life. And then we're going to come back in the large group and talk about the history and all the things that are in the way of this for Simon, or in the way of this for other people in his situation. So I'm suggesting that identity... And now we get into the history itself. We get into the definitions that they need to know about nationalism. And we get into the idea of case studies of times when nationalism interfered with membership in society. And so in classrooms, when I've asked about this in the scope and sequence of a Facing History unit, oftentimes people will come up with examples. For example, the American eugenics movement history, which cast, quote, people that were feeble-minded as outsiders, largely white and poor, by the way. It's ironic, in the 1840s, 1850s, Germany was the beginning of Jewish reform. Germany was the place in Europe where people could come out of the ghettos and into partnership with the larger society. One foot in one world, one foot in the other. A grand place of assimilation in many ways. It doesn't mean it was perfect or that there wasn't prejudice. There was. Doesn't mean there wasn't a lack of membership in community. There was. But of all places, Germany, the most high-minded of European cultures in many ways, where membership in society was afforded to Jews in many ways. Well, what is membership in society, and how do we use the Holocaust, how do we use 1933 to 38, looking at a history of neighbor turning against neighbor? Well, I want to step back in the midst of that precise study, using the people who lived and worked and wrote about that period. I want to also step back and say, what does that mean, that business of turning neighbor against neighbor? How do we make meaning from that for ourselves? Do we have instances of neighbor turning against neighbor? And do we have instances of neighbor turning toward neighbor? And students will raise their hands and say, remember Billings, Montana? Remember the hanging in 10,000 windows of menorahs from the newspaper? They printed a newspaper as a result of a hate crime in Billings, Montana. The Human Relations Commission banded together in 1992 and asked citizens, not Jews particularly, all citizens, to hang menorahs in the windows of all their homes and businesses so that they could send a message to haters that this community would not... Interesting place. Lots of people who are against racism live in Coeur d'Alene, organizing against it on a regular basis. So it's time to step back and say, well, what do we know about cases of membership in society? What about in our own society? What has our school done to make sure everyone feels like a member of the community? What has our city done? Do we even have a human relations council? What have we done in our neighborhoods with our neighbors? How many of us don't even know our neighbors? And people raise their hands. Is it a trivializing? It could be, if it's mishandled. But if you step back into the history in a way that says the history itself has meaning because it happened, you need to know it, because not to know it is to put you in danger of being considerate by historical standards, and because all educated people need to know something about their own and other people's history in order to make their way in life. And because also it is a case in extremis of what can happen when democracy is fragile. So how dare we not step back and ask about our own democracy? How dare we not step back? And it's about participation. So tomorrow I will be at Thurgood Marshall in the morning and at Mission San Jose in Fremont in the afternoon. And the reason I'm going to Mission San Jose High School in the afternoon is that last week they finished a major unit looking deeply, deeply at this history. Deeper than I ever got a chance to look at until I was an adult learner in a professional development organization's training. These people have had a chance to really delve into the history, and now they have a question in mind. What are we to do now that we're armed with this knowledge? Where do we go now? What's our duty? And how do we get beyond the generality? The community service projects that are going to evolve out of Mission San Jose High School over the next 6 weeks are going to knock people's socks off. They're going to make a statement that says, I don't want my grandchildren to look at me in the future and say, you knew that was happening, why didn't you do something about it? Why? Because that's what they heard from an aide at the school whose parents were Nazis, who came here as a child, and she says her children would want to ask her parents some very difficult questions about the history they lived through. A Human Relations Commission to watch for and not allow it to happen. They never want to hear the word faggot on their campus again. Whoa. I got to tell you, on a high school campus, I don't know how many of you have been on one lately, but it is the angry word of choice. It is. And so this student wrote a little paragraph, and here's basically, I should have brought it in head. Here's what the paragraph said in a paraphrase. We've been taught about the actual meaning of the word fag and faggot. Anybody know what it is? A burning ember at the end of a stick. Used for what? Not just lighting a fire. Used for... torture and death. Have been burned at the stake in places in history because of their religion, because of their lack of membership in community, because of their sexuality, because they were labeled perverted. To know that is to recommit to a different way of acting, to invest in the language. To invest in the language is something that a high school kid can drive out of that history. It's a change he can make on his own campus. He's going to get 15 people together, and they're going to make a vow. Whenever they hear the word faggot, they're going to tell the person who used it what it means. They're going to say, don't use that in front of me, I don't go with that. That's their contract. That's a hell of a community service project for a high school. That's a way to put yourself at risk in a high school. Over identity, protecting them. What's that mean about you? Who are you? Those questions may never be asked out loud unless it's by someone very angry and very mean-spirited, but they may be on the minds of a lot of people. It takes a lot of guts for a 15-year-old to turn to his buddy and say, I wish you wouldn't use that kind of language. I don't hold with it. It's bigoted. And you're not that stupid. And to practice it. And to practice it. Yeah?
There's going to
It's okay.
Okay, if you look at the classroom and what you're doing in the classroom, raising these questions, let's look at that as a paradigm that you can take out into the culture and the larger society.
Yeah.
Who is the teacher, or who are the leaders, or how do you move the classroom, the culture, to begin asking these questions?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's the one we're probably going to end with pretty quickly, and then I'll open it up to questions. The idea behind it is this. Facing History doesn't operate in a vacuum as an organization. The idea is that we bring teachers together from all walks of life and all kinds of communities. We bring them together for 5-day institutes and for 1-day seminars, and we go into their classrooms 3 days a week. My job is to go out into the field and work side by side with the teachers who've been through some of our training, who are implementing some of these ideas, who are wrestling with some of these issues themselves in unique ways. There are probably over 100 schools in the Bay Area, from Santa Rosa down to Salinas, which is the area I cover, along with a partner and a teacher leadership team of 15 volunteers. And we are committed to the idea that each of them is unique. Each single person, each classroom situation, each community. So that a Facing History class taught in Milpitas is taught in an environment where over 50 teachers out of 100 in the school through week-long seminars and who reconnect with us on a regular basis and who cooperate and collaborate with our nonprofit to do more and more in-servicing all the time. Their school play this year is Diary of Anne Frank. I just finished a mini course for the cast because that's how committed they are. It's never done in a vacuum at that school. They're going to root their learning. The biology classes at Milpitas High School teach a unit on eugenics and on bioethical issues. All right? So there's a whole school in place. Many other schools do it very differently than that. Many of their grassroots, you have a teacher here and a teacher there, so that when I visit Mission San Jose tomorrow, my goal is that I won't be there alone, that the teacher who's hosting me to do some more work with the kids that he's been working with for 8 weeks in this program already, are going to be able to say, he's going to be able to go to his colleagues and say, if you have a prep period, you need to come in. And part of what Jack is going to do is not just work with this class. I have to meet with them after school. Because the conditions for dealing with this are a partnership so that the school vision is moved forward. So that the standards movement that all these teachers are working on can be held accountable in a different way than just responding to the needs of property values. Because that's what the standards movement is sometimes about in our society right now. It's about worry and accountability, about literacy, but it's also about the news and what are we doing with our kids. And I want it more than that. And I want it to be about the big questions that teachers ought to be asking in the midst of good teaching. It's got to be not only about the content, but about the pedagogy. And it's got to be about raising the bar in the school. You can't do that with one person alone. You have to build the community of adult learners to do that. So Facing History goes into the school with a vision of what whole school change can look like, so that every turn there are opportunities for students to confront issues about identity, issues about membership in community, the legacies of hard history, and ways to participate and make meaning. And that's the template that we use. But in a middle school, it looks very different than it does in a high school. In an honors class, it looks very different than it does in a class of remedial readers. The questions have to be the same, folks. They can't be different questions. In 1981, I was teaching at Milpitas High School when a murder took place. You may know about this murder. It was a murder of a young woman named Marcy Conrad. Marcy Conrad was 14 years old. She was murdered by a student that I had for 2 weeks named Jacques Broussard. He's still in prison today. A horrible movie was made about this later called The River's Edge. I don't know if anybody's seen it. I don't recommend it. It's a horrible, horrible movie. But it does point out one idea. In that room where I had, in my 3rd year of teaching at Milpitas High School, been given, because I was low man on the totem pole, and that's the way education worked in Milpitas in 1981, I was the new hire, so I got the remedial classes. Serious. Now it's changed, thank God, in Milpitas since then. But in those days, that's what I had, 3 courses. In one class, I had 17 boys on probation. Legal, in the legal. And he was one of them. And after 2 weeks, he tested out because he shouldn't have been there. He was extremely literate. What do we mean by education? Yeah? Because he went out a couple of weeks after that and he murdered strangled, sexually assaulted, threw a body over a ravine. You know, he went out and did that, and then he came back to school and bragged about it to his alienated friends, who most of them would be caught down by the creek where the smokers and the stoners hung out. They had a uniform too. They had a uniform. You could tell who they were. Identity reared its ugly head. When that young man was caught and he was put in jail for life imprisonment, he won't come up for parole again for a number of years. He's been denied twice already. My students, who I was given packets in those years, you know what the packets were? Handwriting packets. And they were literacy packets about phonetic reading. They were deadening to the souls of potential adult learners. They were deadening. And so every day I sneaked in newspapers. And we read newspapers with each other. But when this thing took place, all hell broke loose. All of a sudden, I was getting notes from my students. You know, they were pretty doggone literate. How come I didn't know that? You know, we labeled them. We gave them an identity. We told people who they were. They lived up or down to the identity they were given. They said, we got to do something about this. People are telling us Milpitas High is a terrible place. And they're calling us murderers. Some kid came in and said, I went to work yesterday and people wrote homicide high on my car. And so we began to discuss the issues inherent in all this. And pretty soon, they were producing letters to the editor about violence in society and about community. You can go to the Mercury News in 1981 and find some of their letters. They were printed. They were printed. Where it says Milpitas High School, that's the group underneath their names. And I took those letters, handwritten, and I took them in, I took the names off them before they were printed in the newspaper and put them out on the table in the English department of my own high school, where I had great respect for the people I was working with. Some of them were asking the same questions. And put a sign there that said, read me. Well, the dialogue started. Because teachers don't get a chance to see each other if they don't have the same prep period. You work in utter isolation from adults. It's true. And so I got notes. Hey, who wrote this? This is pretty damn good. Can I use it in my class? I waited. Before long, something amazing happened. I went to the kids who wrote the letters and said, Mr. So-and-so wanted to use your letter in his class, but I think that you ought to go and read it out loud to them and lead the discussion, because you can do it better than. This kid looked at me and said, cool. Hell, he'd never been asked to do that in his life. He got up, he went to the classroom. The teacher in the classroom was a good guy, but he never thought about this kid as a potential teacher. Kid said, I was really pissed off about all this stuff that was happening, and I wrote about it, and that's what we're going to share with you now. And he read his letter to the class. If you give them something to chew on and let them make connections to their own lives, they'll do amazing things. And the very next year, I went to Yad Vashem, studied for 4 weeks, came back, committed to the idea of teaching about race, power, and privilege through literature, committed to the idea of teaching about Holocaust and human relations, human rights, and well. The A students are the college-bound students. The B students are your average everyday kids, and the C students are your kids on probation, troubles, and not going to graduate from high school. So they gave me the class the first day, and it's the first thing I said to them. This is a special class. It is not an A, B, or C class. It's an English 1 class. They all looked at each other like, so? I said, so what that means is that we're not following the 1 curriculum. We're following the English 1 curriculum. That means we are going to do Romeo and Juliet instead of the movie. Serious. That means we are going to do Night by Elie Wiesel instead of Friedrich by Hans-Peter Richter, which is written at a 5th and 6th grade readability level. Not a bad little book. It's a novel. Sort of one of those I was there kinds of books. Show up, we went and picked them up. It averaged 2 a day for the first week. And it never happened again. And I had the lowest absence rate of any of the English classes in the first period that semester. How do you raise the bar? Is it about the Holocaust? I'm not even talking about the Holocaust now. It is about the Holocaust. It is about identity. It is about membership in community. It is about the legacies of hard history. And it is about participation and making a decision to participate. Now, I had something I was going to show you, but I think I would rather open up to questions at this point, because at 5:30 I'm going to make a beeline for an an independent school where I'm meeting with a group of students and their parents. So let's open it up now. I'm not much into self-congratulation, so I don't care about applause. I'd rather have your questions and comments, and I'm willing to do that now. And comments, and I'm willing to do that now. Yes? You want a job? You want to come to work for Facing History? Yeah. Actually, we're next year, I think, or the year after next for sure, we're going to offer internships. So you should come to our website at facinghistory.org. We're a very small office, but I'd be very interested who would like either volunteer or perhaps look for the idea of an internship with us. Yeah?
How about a workshop here in Sonoma County?
I've been doing workshops in Sonoma County for years, only once or twice a year, and would up the ante gladly. It only needs to have the possibilities laid out because I'm not on site. So yes, absolutely so. Yes?
Do you have any Sacramento area?
I do, actually. We will in certain ways cover Sacramento. In fact, if you go to Elk Grove, we have a teacher on our teacher leadership team there, Kitty Laubacker, who will mentor, monitor, aid, help, get courses started, do in-service training. She does it with a lot of our material. She's a very experienced teacher. She's a wonderful person, and we can extend this vision into lots of geographical areas. Yes?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about the year-long, like, do you enjoy that more so than the traditional taking 3 months off?
I never took 3 months off in my life, but it's just never been a possibility for me because I need to eat and like to. But this job is very different. You know what I miss about the classroom? Because what Philip may not realize anymore, and this is not a criticism at all, I loved your introduction. I no longer work with Milpitas Unified except for through Facing History, because this role has extended and expanded, and we have partnerships with over 100 schools that we need to put a lot of energy into. Milpitas High is an amazing place. If anyone wanted to visit a Facing History class, that's the first one on the list. If you wanted to see a course in action, to see young people making meaning of this history in amazing ways, that's a place to see. But so I'm full-time now with Facing History. What I miss is the community of 30 people in a room. And this is unusual for me. I don't usually do this kind of public speaking. Usually I'm in classrooms with students or in small groups of teachers doing the hands-on work with the history. Hands-on work, and stopping to pull back and ask these questions that can deepen their commitment to drawing the relationship between history and their own. Yeah.
And do parents have a role?
Parents have an incredible role. At Thurgood Marshall, for example, the whole idea of parent education has become a reality where once every 3 weeks the students bring one or more parents to a night activity, and so far what they've chosen to bring them for are activities with a Holocaust survivor, with a Holocaust scholar who spoke to this group, and with, they did their own leadership.
This curriculum, do you give them like a reading list, or do they all follow the same type of books?
Yeah, people don't normally sign up to do this. What they do is they wrestle with their own abilities to do it and with their own inclination to do it. They come through a 5-day summer institute. If anybody's interested in that institute, it's the only thing this nonprofit charges any money for, by the way, because we charge room and board at a retreat house. It's open to educators and very limited numbers of people. So if anybody's interested, Joel will have these. I'm not going to do it now, but he can do it if anybody's interested, either on the way out or however. And you're absolutely invited. We have a limited number of spots for community members And we're a nonprofit. We're always looking for people who have connections to charitable organizations or corporations or individuals who might be interested in supporting this work. We're a nonprofit. We live or die by the support of the community. Call 626 information, ask for Facing History, and they'll tell you. Yes?
Is it appropriate to address a real-time moral dilemma?
Now? Well, you might have to do it with them because in about 5 minutes I have to be on the road. But
the dilemma revolves around the question, I've been trying to call attention to one of the most disastrous possibility that I won't get another chance.
it's a university. This is a university. This is not a question for me. If I were in your situation, I would do it. You know, if I were in your situation, I would do it. People are adults. They have the right to take it, leave it, understand it, question about it. So be it. Yes?
In your teaching, did you ever cross any Gothics or Mafia or just people who are completely alienated and opposed to what you're trying to do?
In the 20 years that I've been teaching in high schools, I've run into white supremacists, self-proclaimed Goths, junior members of the Ku Klux Klan, skinheads of various persuasions, not all of them racists, and others. But few and far between. And by the way, young people, like all of us, are works in progress. So until they stay over the line, they're still part of our universe of obligation. If you're asking whether I've had an opportunity to confront people and challenge their value systems, the answer is yes. And it's wonderful to get a group of educators together and discuss a question like that, which we do fairly often in Facing History's network. We sit together and say, well, what is the response? What are the boundaries that we deal with? What is the purview that we have? What does state law empower us to do? Do we have time to these guys or not? And the answer is absolutely not. We have a right to teach tolerance. We have a right to teach acceptance. We have a right to teach that racism is evil. We have an obligation to do those things under state law. And so on one-on-one basis, we might respond differently to young people. I had a young man come into my class wearing a swastika once, about 15 years ago. I took him aside and said, do you know what that means? He said, yeah, what do you mean? I said, what does it mean? Some kind of good luck symbol. It wasn't turned the wrong way. It was a swastika. It wasn't a good luck symbol. So I said, well, you and I need to talk, because if you're going to wear that in my classroom, you need to know what it means. And you need to know what it means to me as a person. So let's take a walk. I knocked on the door of my partner teacher, said, you need to take the class for the next 15 minutes, I'll be back. We went out and walked around the track. By the time we got back to the classroom, he was willing to take it off. Now, I could have done something different. I could have gone, as many teachers would, to the phone and said, send security down here, I want this kid out of my classroom. You know, I mean, there's a world of answers beyond that, but it's a symbolic one. What else? Yes?
Your teaching is non-traditional. It's very different from the rest of the teachers. What kind of acceptance do you get from them?
Appropriate. And I was asked to join the Facing History staff in 1992. And I said no. I wanted their learning and I wanted their help, but I wasn't ready to do what they were doing. And this year, in fact, next week, I'll go to Amador High in Pleasanton, where a young woman named Wendy Garner, who came through our institute in 1993 and wrestled with it for months and has come back for seminars here and there, has come back to a second and will take our advanced institute this summer, has begun to work on a curriculum for a year-long course in the English department, not in the history department, called Facing History and Ourselves Through Literature. So she's not doing it by herself. We're learning and growing along with her. She's finally ready to try and take it on, but she realizes she's at the very beginning stages, even though she's 8 years into her own struggle. This is a life work. This isn't about a course. This isn't about an in-service. This isn't about a dog and pony show. That's what professional development has been in education. It's been about somebody coming and doing a song and dance and disappearing, and if you like what they did, you might try it a few times. That's the way I was trained. I had the best teacher in history working next door to me at Milpitas High School. Alice Kawazoe is probably one of the very best language and literature teachers in the history of the country. She's recognized as such all over the world through Bay Area Writing Project, National Writing Project. You know what I used to do in my first year? I used to hold a glass to the wall because it wasn't appropriate to go in. We didn't have those kinds of partnerships. The rooms weren't built for that. We worked in utter isolation. She caught me one day. And then I became a student in her class in my first year at Milpitas High School. So there's a long history behind all of this. There's a long takeoff ramp behind all this. And I appreciate your rapt attention, and thank you.
Probably stay here as long as you possibly could. You need to get your things. Are there
If it's still here. No. Okay.